Hello, boys and girls, and a special hello to Sasanda today because I know she's been listening to all the stories on Library Hour. Today, we're going to be listening to a story you're going to love. It's called Library Lion. It's one of my many favorites, and it's written by Michelle Knudsen, the author, and illustrated by Kevin Hawkes. And it's a story about a lion who marches into a library. How exciting wouldn't that be? A little bit scary too, if we had a lion march into our library. One day, a lion came to the library. He walked right past the circulation desk and up into the stacks. The stacks are the bookshelves. So he walked right past the circulation desk where you return your books, and when you've chosen new books, you hand them in, and he walked right past. The man looked quite shocked, didn't he? His name is Mr. McBee. Mr. McBee ran down the hall to the head librarian's office. "Miss Merriweather," he called. "No running," said Miss Merriweather without looking up. "But there's a lion," said Mr. McBee, "in the library." "Well, is he breaking any rules?" asked Miss Merriweather. She was very particular about rule breaking. "Well, no," said Mr. McBee, "not really." "Then let him be," said Miss Merriweather quietly. The lion wandered all around the library. He sniffed at the card catalogue. Modern libraries don't have card catalogues anymore because they put all the information onto the computers. And then he rubbed his head against the new book collection. I'm sure you all love new books as much as the lion was. And then he padded along to the story corner and went to sleep. No one was sure what to do. There weren't any rules about lions in the library. I don't have any rules about lions in my library. Soon it was time for story hour. There weren't any rules about lions at story hour either. The story lady seemed a little nervous, but she read out the first book's title in a good, clear voice. The lion looked up. The story lady kept reading. So she was a bit nervous first of all because she'd never had a lion come to listen to her stories before. The lion stayed for the next story, and the story after that. He waited for another story, but the children began to walk away. "Story hour is over," a little girl told him. "It's time to go home." The lion looked at the children. Then he looked at the story lady. He looked at the closed books. And then he roared very loud. Roar! He loved stories, didn't he? Miss Merriweather came striding out of her office. "Who is making that noise?" she demanded. "It's the lion," said Mr. McBee. Miss Merriweather marched over to the lion. "If you cannot be quiet, you will have to leave," she said in a stern voice. "Those are the rules." The lion kept roaring. He sounded sad. The little girl tugged on Miss Merriweather's dress. "If he promises to be quiet, can he come back for story hour tomorrow?" she asked. The lion stopped roaring. He looked at Miss Merriweather. Miss Merriweather looked back, and then she said, "Yes, a nice quiet lion would certainly be allowed to come back for story hour tomorrow." "Hooray!" said the children. And the next day the lion came back. "You are early," said Miss Merriweather. "Story hour is not until 3 o'clock." But the lion did not budge. It means he didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was sitting. "Very well," said Miss Merriweather. "You might as well make yourself useful." So she sent him off to dust the encyclopedias. The encyclopedias is a collection of books that you use when you need to look up information. Many people these days just use Google instead. But there he is, using his tail as a feather duster to dust all the encyclopedias. And he did that until it was story hour. The next day the lion came early again, and this time Miss Merriweather asked him to lick all the envelopes for the overdue notices. So if you return your book late, the librarian sends a letter home to remind you to return the book. So he had to lick all the envelopes. Soon the lion began doing things without even being asked. He dusted the encyclopedias, he licked the envelopes, and he let small children stand on his back to reach the books on the highest shelves. And then he curled up in the story corner to wait for story hour to begin. At first, the people in the library were nervous about the lion. But soon they got used to having him around. In fact, he seemed very well suited for the library. His big feet were quiet on the library floor. He made a comfy backrest for the children at story hour to lean against, like a big soft cushion. And he never roared in the library any more. "What a helpful lion," the people said. They patted his soft head as he walked by. "How did we ever get along without him?" Mr. McBee scowled when he heard that. They had always gotten along fine before. No lions were needed. Lions, he thought, could not understand rules. They did not belong in the library. One day, after he had dusted all the encyclopedias and licked all the envelopes and helped all the small children, the lion padded down the hall to Miss Merriweather's office to see what else there was to do. There was still some time left before story hour. "Oh, hello, Lion," said Miss Merriweather. "I know something you can do. You can bring a book back into the stacks for me. Let me just get it down from the shelf." Miss Merriweather stepped up onto the step stool. The book was just out of reach. Miss Merriweather stood on her toes and she stretched out her fingers. "Almost there," she said. Then Miss Merriweather stretched just a little too far. "Ouch!" said Miss Merriweather softly. She did not get up. There she is lying on the floor behind her desk. She fell off her step stool. "Mr. McBee," she called after a minute. "Mr. McBee." But Mr. McBee was at the circulation desk. He could not hear her calling. "Lion," said Miss Merriweather, "please go and get Mr. McBee." The lion ran down the hall. "No running," Miss Merriweather called after him. The lion put his big front paws up on the circulation desk and looked at Mr. McBee. "Go away, Lion," said Mr. McBee. "I'm busy." The lion whined. He pointed his nose down the hall toward Miss Merriweather's office, but Mr. McBee ignored him. Finally, the lion did the only thing he could think of to do. He looked Mr. McBee right in the eye. Then he opened his mouth very wide, and he roared the loudest roar he had ever roared in his life. So loud that Mr. McBee's glasses flew off the top of his head. Mr. McBee gasped. "You're not being quiet," he said to the lion. "You're breaking the rules." Mr. McBee walked down the hall as fast as he could. The lion did not follow him. He had broken the rules, and he knew what that meant. So he hung his head and he walked towards the door. He was leaving the library. Mr. McBee did not notice. "Miss Merriweather," he called as he walked. "Miss Merriweather, the lion broke the rules. The lion broke the rules." And he burst into Miss Merriweather's office. But she was not in her chair. "Miss Merriweather?" he asked. "Sometimes," said Miss Merriweather from the floor behind her desk, "there is a good reason to break the rules, even in the library. Now please go call a doctor. I think I've broken my arm. Mr. McBee ran to call a doctor. No running, Miss Merriweather called after him. The next day, things were back to normal. Almost. Miss Merriweather's left arm was in a cast. You can see she has a sling around her neck. There she is there, because her arm is in a cast, a plaster of Paris cast. The doctor had told her not to work too hard. I will have my lion to help me, Miss Merriweather thought. But the lion did not come to the library that morning. At 3 o'clock, Miss Merriweather walked over to the story corner. The story lady was just beginning a story for the children, but the lion was not there. People in the library kept looking up from their books and computer screens, hoping they would see a familiar furry face. But the lion did not come that day, and the lion did not come the next day either, or the day after that. See, they're looking to see where the lion could be hiding. They're missing their library lion. One evening, Mr. McBee stopped by Miss Merriweather's office on his way home. Can I do anything for you before I go, Miss Merriweather? He asked her. No, thank you, said Miss Merriweather. She was looking out the window. Her voice was very quiet, even for the library. Mr. McBee frowned. As he walked away, he thought there probably was something he could do for Miss Merriweather after all. I wonder what he's going to do for Miss Merriweather. Mr. McBee left the library, but he did not go home. He walked around the neighborhood. And he looked under cars. And he looked behind the bushes. He looked in backyards and trash cans and tree houses. What do you think he was looking for? The lion. I think you're right. Finally, he circled all the way back to the library, and the lion was sitting outside, looking in through the glass doors. Hello, lion, said Mr. McBee. The lion did not turn around. I thought you might like to know, said Mr. McBee, that there's a new rule in the library. No roaring allowed unless you have a very good reason. Say if you're trying to help a friend who's been hurt, for example. The lion's ears twitched. He turned around, but Mr. McBee was already walking away, so his ears twitched. They moved a little bit. The next day, Mr. McBee walked down the hall to Miss Merriweather's office. What is it, Mr. McBee? Asked Miss Merriweather in her new, sad, quiet voice. I thought you might like to know, said Mr. McBee, that there's a lion in the library. Miss Merriweather jumped up from her chair and ran down the hall. Mr. McBee smiled. No running, he called after her, and Miss Merriweather didn't listen. She was so excited to hear that the library lion was back. Sometimes there was a good reason to break the rules, even in the library. Everybody's clapping and jumping because their lion is back. And I'm sure you loved that book. If you did, please remember to give it a thumbs up and listen along next week when we have this story, and it's called What's Cooking? Jamela. It's another lovely story by Nikki Daly. Remember last time we read a Nikki Daly book? It was called The Herd Boy, the story about Malusi, the shepherd boy. So thank you so much for listening, and goodbye, boys and girls.